00051. A talk with Fury? It didn't take long for Tao to transport all of the vibranium back to the base along with Clow, who had a headset on, as well as a blindfold. He was also cuffed and gagged. Ezekiel stopped by Hank's lab with about 100 pounds of vibranium. Hank, Bill, and Darren were all in shock, but Hank recovered the fastest and gave Ezekiel a firm handshake and thanked him for the vibranium. Ezekiel with his group then headed back to his work area to plan out their next course of action and have a slight mission debrief. Everyone removed their masks and clipped them to their vests as they sat down together on some couches. Ezekiel around at the others, and a smile graced his lips for a moment as he looked at his current teammates. Kakashi had a wolf mask, Itachi a crow mask, and Shursui was the owner of a cat mask. Ezekiel looked directly at Kakashi as he asked, "So how did I do?" Kakashi smiled under his half-face mask, and if it wasn't for his eye squinting slightly, Ezekiel wouldn't have noticed. Kakashi's smile faded as he said, "I would say you have a passing grade for a first-year academy student, but failed miserably for a genin." Ezekiel was shocked as Itachi said, "Kakashi-senpai is correct. You are proficient in Genjutsu, body flicker, and a few other ninjutsu. You have massive chakra reserves for your age and decent chakra control. But all of your basic shinobi skills are close to a clanless first-year student." What Itachi is trying to say is that they don't exist. Shursui smiled from his seat, and Ezekiel's face crumbled in defeat. Kakashi smiled again as he said, "Look on the bright side. You have close to 10 years to improve, and you have us plus everyone's memories." Shursui nodded as he said, "Plus, once we have our own bodies, we will have to train to regain our skills. So you will have a bunch of training partners." Itachi frowned as he said, "It will be nice to have a body again. Even though we are clones, I think we are only around Genin rank in power currently, even with our ninja skills being around Chunin level. These clone bodies and your true age are holding us back by a lot." Ezekiel smirked as he said sarcastically, "Sorry, my kid body is holding you guys back." Kakashi shook his head as he said, "No, we're sorry. We just aren't used to being so weak, and it's a little frustrating." Itachi nodded as he said, "Exactly, even when I was dying, I wasn't this weak in power." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I understand, but there is not much we can do about it for now." Shursui looked at Kakashi as he said, "Enough talking about something currently out of our control. We should plan for Wakanda." Kakashi looked to Ezekiel as he said, "You will have to follow Eric out in the open. You don't have the skills to hide properly at all." "That's fine. I will start making a background for myself." Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and began to fabricate a background for himself as the others discussed different possibilities for what might happen in Wakanda. Hours passed, and when it was finally time, they went to pick up Eric. Eric had dressed up a little. It wasn't a full suit or anything, just a nicer pair of pants and a button-up shirt. His father's ring was hanging from a necklace he wore. Eric was a little surprised when Ezekiel came to get him. Ezekiel had 3 other people with him, and they were all dressed the same. They wore black long-sleeved shirts and pants. The pants were tucked into some black combat boots. Around their chests, they each wore what looked like a dark gray tactical vest which had pouches. They also had a belt with some pouches around their waists, along with black gloves that had dark-colored metal protecting the back of their hands and lower arms. Ezekiel was the only one who didn't have a sword strapped to his back. The thing that surprised Eric the most was the masks each one had on. They were white and red in color, and each person had a different style. He wasn't sure which one was Ezekiel until he said, "From now on, just call me Bear until we are done in Wakanda. This is Wolf, Crow, and Cat. They will be with us, but out of sight. Do you have any questions before we leave?" Eric nodded his head and pulled out a few pieces of paper which he handed to Ezekiel as he said, "I reread my father's journal while I was waiting to leave. It gave me some ideas on what to say, but what do you think?" Ezekiel took the papers and read each of them, and he had to admit again, the kid was smart. He thought of a bunch of different ways it could go and wrote down what he thought he should do, depending on what situation came up. When Ezekiel was finished with a paper, he passed it to the next person, who read it and then passed it to the next person. Once everyone had finished reading them, they took another hour to fine-tune anything they thought might cause an issue with their plans. Once finished, they went to grab Tao, who was currently doing some extra training with Ava. Once they collected Tao, they went to pick up Clow from his holding cell and ran into an issue. Fury was there waiting for them. He had found out about Clow being held at the base an hour ago and came back to see what was going on. When he found Clow with a blindfold, headset, and gag on, bound to a chair in a holding cell, Fury decided to do some paperwork while he waited for Ezekiel to show up. Ezekiel waved at Fury as he asked, "What are you doing here?" Fury took in the group of Tao, Eric, Ezekiel, and the other three wearing masks and said, "Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. What are you planning to do with a wanted arms dealer, and why is Stevens with you?" "Clow is wanted in Wakanda. We are taking him there now to turn him in. As for Eric, his father was born in Wakanda. I figured Eric might want to see where his father grew up." Fury raised an eyebrow at that as he said, "So why are all of you dressed up like that? You almost look like bodyguards, except for the weird masks, and you don't have any guns." "You don't need guns to be a bodyguard. As for the masks, they are part of the uniform." Fury still looked skeptical as he said, "Fine, I don't really care about that. What I do care about is where you found over a quarter-ton of vibranium." Fury was almost yelling when he finished speaking. Ezekiel pointed at the cell where Clow was as he said, "When I went to grab him, I found it among his inventory. So I brought it with me." Fury glared at Ezekiel as he said, "That's funny, because I heard that you told Hank the other day you knew someone who had some vibranium. I might have known Clow was in possession of some stolen vibranium." Fury let out a sigh as he said, "I am getting real tired of you withholding information, Ezekiel." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "What good would telling you about it do? We had no need for it, and I knew no one would even touch it for the next 15 years or so." Fury pointed at Ezekiel as he said in a raised voice, "It's that attitude of yours that I hate. You decided not to tell us about something because you decided it was not important." Ezekiel stared back at Fury before he said, "Sounds a lot like someone I know. Are you upset because I act like you, or because it's not fun when someone else is holding all the cards?" Fury glared back at Ezekiel for a moment before he said, "What we do is fundamentally different. I keep secrets because it's my job, and if they get out, it could lead to panic by the general public. You keep secrets because you think we can't handle what you know." Ezekiel watched Fury for a few moments before he said, "How is that any different? If I told you a fraction of what I have seen, you would panic and start taking drastic and dumb measures to try and stop what is coming." Fury raised his voice again as he said, "That's bullshit. I can handle whatever you tell me without going into a panic." "Fine, have it your way." Fury started to speak, but froze, his eyes glazed over and his body relaxed. Ezekiel walked past him as he said, "Wolf, put him on a bed in one of the empty cells." As Wolf picked up Fury, Tao asked, "Was that really the best idea?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Not really, but I am getting tired of him fighting me at every turn. I am just showing him different futures where his paranoia causes major issues for Earth. Hopefully that will allow him to trust me a little bit more." Crow walked past Ezekiel into Clow's cell and brought the man out as Tao said, showing him the folly of his own ways. "Pretty much. Hopefully it will make him relax just a little bit and want to work more as a team. I honestly like that he questions me and will find issues with my plans. What I don't like is him wanting to know everything I know because he thinks he knows better." Tao raised an eyebrow at that as she asked, "Are you saying you know better?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, but I know what could happen and I am not in a panic about it." Eric had been listening to them talk as they were walking and asked, "If you can see the future, what is going to happen when we get to Wakanda?" As they started to move out of the holding area towards the portal area, Ezekiel glanced back at Eric as he said, "I saw the future before. I can't see it anymore. As for what happens in Wakanda, I have no idea." Eric frowned as he asked, "But didn't you show me the future the other day?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I showed you the future you were going towards with the actions you had planned to take. Now that has all changed and I have no idea what is in store for you." Eric was quiet for the rest of the walk as he thought over Ezekiel's words. Once they got to the portal platform, Ezekiel said, "Everyone ready?" Ezekiel looked back at everyone and they all nodded, even Tao. Ezekiel nodded back as he said, "One portal to the forest, just outside of the main border tribe village, please. 00052. Going to Wakanda." Tao moved her hands, and a portal appeared as she faded away into the mirror dimension. While Wolf, Crow and Cat disappeared from their spots, leaving Ezekiel and Eric alone with their prisoner. Ezekiel pushed Clow forward through the portal as Eric followed behind him. Once they stepped through the portal, it snapped closed behind them. Eric took a quick look around and couldn't see the others anywhere and asked, "Can you disappear like that too?" Ezekiel shook his head, then pointed in a direction as he said, "Not yet. I still have a lot of training left to do. Let's move out. I think we have about a half an hour hike before we get to the village." Eric nodded his head and started to walk in front of Ezekiel and Clow. They walked in silence for almost 20 minutes before they left the forest and were greeted by a field of ankle-high grass. In the distance was a small village of huts surrounded by a fence made of logs. The early morning sun was still low in the sky and painted the whole area in a rosy radiance. As soon as Ezekiel and his group exited the forest, people in the village noticed the three people walking towards the village. Within a moment, a few people who carried spears left the village and met Ezekiel's group about halfway to the village from the forest. A man stepped out of the group from the village. He was decently tall with dark skin and had a scarification done to his face. It was a pattern of 10 dots, and they went from his ears to almost under his nose. The man eyed them warily. The boy seemed the most out of place for walking through the forest surrounding the village. The other two men looked better equipped for hiking through a forest, but both of them were odd. One of the men was bound with a face covering. The other man wore tactical gear and a white and red mask. Tetamu planted his spear in front of himself as he said in English, "You've just entered Wakanda. Our borders are closed to outsiders. You will have to turn around and leave at once." Eric looked at the man in front of him as he said, "I am Jadaka, son of Njobu. I have come to my father's homeland to visit for the first time." Eric then pointed to the bound man as he said, "From my understanding, this person is a criminal of Wakanda and the other person is Bear, a friend of mine." The man looked a little shocked hearing the name Jobu. He was the king's brother who had gone missing over 6 years ago. As the man was looking at the teenager in front of him, the man in the mask named Bear brought the bound man forward. Tetamu and his men tensed up slightly, but as the masked man Bear pulled off the other man's head covering, they stopped. Tetamu was the first to react as he asked, "Is that Ulysses Clow?" Jadaka nodded his head as he said, "Yes, he was captured by my men this morning." Tetamu bowed his head deeply and said, "I am Tetamu, leader of the border tribe. Wakanda is in your debt for bringing us Clow." Jadaka smiled and lifted up his father's ring as he said, "Tetamu, this was my father's ring. Is this good enough to prove that I am Jobu's son?" Tetamu nodded just slightly as he said, "Yes, it should help you, but I am sure people will also want a blood test done." Jadaka reached up and pulled his lower lip down to show the war dog mark on his lip. Tetamu's eyes widened just a little bit at that before he said, "That will also help you." Tetamu glanced at the man named Bear as he said, "We still don't allow outsiders inside the borders. We have secrets to keep. I have already told Bear everything my father told me about Wakanda. He goes wherever I go." Tetamu had a shocked look as he glanced between Jadaka and Bear. He then settled his firm gaze on Jadaka and said, "Telling an outsider those secrets could get you in a lot of trouble. I will allow him to accompany you for now, after he is checked for weapons. But it will be up to other people if he is allowed to stay with you the whole time." Eric nodded his head as he said, "Bear, let them check you for weapons." Bear let go of Clow and then stood with his arms and legs apart. One of the men took a hold of Clow, while the other man did a thorough search of Bear. When he found nothing, he moved back to Tetamu and nodded his head as he passed him. Tetamu looked at the man named Bear and said, "You will need to remove your mask, Mr. Bear." Bear looked towards Jadaka for orders. Jadaka looked back and said, "You can remove your mask." When Bear removed his mask, Jadaka was glad he was facing the other way. The man under the mask looked nothing like Ezekiel normally did. Sure, his hair was black, but everything else was different. His face was covered in scars. His eyes had a hard edge to them, like he was always looking for the next threat. Bear nodded his head to Jadaka as he clipped his mask to his vest. Tetamu and his men took in the man named Bear and were instantly more on edge. With the mask on, they didn't notice it, but with the mask off, they could see the man's hard eyes. He looked at Tetamu and his men like they weren't a threat to him. Tetamu decided he would make sure he was always a full spear length away from Bear, just in case. Tetamu looked back at Jadaka and said, Come with us to the village. I need to make a report and get some transport for us. Jidaka nodded in reply as he and Bear started to walk towards the village. It didn't take long for them to reach the village, and they were shown a hut to use while they waited for transport. Eric wanted to ask Bear some questions, but as he went to speak, Bear shook his head. Eric took the hint and decided to ask his questions later after they returned to the base. They didn't have to wait long before their transport arrived. It was a cloaked Royal Talon fighter which made no sound and couldn't be seen at all. Only when the rear ramp opened up could you tell that something was there. Out of the back, 7 Dora Milaje appeared and walked down the exposed ramp of the plane. One of the women went straight to Tetamu and started talking to him. It wasn't long before Tetamu pointed towards the hut which Njidaka and Bear currently resided in. The woman looked over at the hut for a moment as she talked to Tetamu. After a few minutes of conversation, Tetamu and the woman walked over to Njidaka and Bear's hut. Tetamu entered the hut and brought out Njidaka and Bear. Once outside, the woman said, "I am Owibaya of the Dora Milaje. Tetamu said you claim to be the son of the king's missing brother Njobu. You will have to come with us so we can verify your claims." She glanced at the man next to Eric as she said, "Your friend can join you for now. But be warned, if he makes one false move, we will not hesitate to detain him or kill him depending on his actions. Is that understood?" Jidaka nodded his head as he said, "Bear won't attack unless he thinks my life's in danger. Otherwise, he is just like a giant teddy bear. Isn't that right, Bear?" Bear nodded in reply. Owibaya eyed the man for a few seconds more, then Owibaya glanced behind her as she said, "Bring the scanner." 2 more Dora Milaje walked over carrying a device between them. They placed it on the ground and stood on each side of it. Owibaya touched some beads on her wrist, and the device expanded open. It looked like a metal doorway. In place of a door, there was a neon blue light that covered the opening. Owibaya glanced at Eric and Bear as she said, "Each of you take turns standing in the middle of the scanner. I will tell you when to leave it." Eric glanced at Bear for a moment before he stepped forward into the opening. Owibaya touched the beads on her wrist, and a small holographic screen appeared in front of her. She touched it a few times, and the light in the doorway began to change colors a few times. When it went back to blue, Owibaya said, "You can switch places with your friend now." Eric stepped out of the doorway as he said, "Your turn, Bear." Bear stepped forward into the doorway, and the process repeated, but took twice as long. Once finished, Owibaya studied the screen for a few minutes before she turned to Tetamu and said, "Get Clow. We need to scan him before heading back." Tetamu's men brought out Clow, who now had different cuffs on. His blindfold, gag, and ear protection was removed, and he had a smile on his face. When he saw Bear with his distinct red and white mask, he frowned. When they walked close, Clow said, "You fucked up thinking you could make friends with Wakanda. These people are savages, and they don't tolerate outsiders like us. You should have just been happy buying the vibranium I had." Bear just looked at Clow, who started to smile again as he said, "Well, doesn't matter. You paid me. When I get out of here, I will be set for life." Tetamu pushed Clow into the doorway as he said, "You won't be going anywhere. Now shut up." As the device started to scan Clow, he said, "I escaped once before. I can do it again, sweetheart." A heavy Russian accent was heard as Bear said, "Your bank accounts were drained." Clow lost his smile as the device finished working. As he was pulled out of the device, he looked at Bear and said, "You really know how to kick a man when he's down, don't you?" Owibaya glanced at Clow as she said, "Load him in the ship, and if he keeps talking, I want him gagged." Owibaya glanced at Eric and Bear as she said, "Everyone is cleared. Let's go get your blood work done." 00053 Blood Test. Jidaka and Bear were seated with a good view of the outside as the Royal Talon fighter flew to the capital of Wakanda. The only thing they could see for miles was dense forested areas. After 10 minutes passed, they could see a mountain in front of them that the plane was heading for. As they flew closer to the mountain, Eric glanced at Bear, who just smiled slightly in response. Just as the plane hit the mountain, it passed through a barrier and a sprawling metropolis could be seen in the distance before them. Eric was stunned. It was his first real time seeing the place his father always talked about with such passion. Eric studied the city while the plane took them to the outer area of the capital city of Wakanda, next to a giant panther statue that overlooked the city. When they exited the back of the plane, Eric took a few moments to admire the view before Bear and himself were ushered into a building underneath the mountain the panther statue sat on. It was a facility that they used for what seemed like prisoners, as far as Eric could tell. Bear was allowed to stay with Eric while they did a blood test. But that wasn't saying much. The room they were brought to was almost completely bare besides a table and some chairs for them to use. Someone came into the room after they were dropped off and took a blood sample before leaving them alone. It was about an hour later when Owibaya came inside and said, "Sorry for the wait, Jidaka. We just wanted to verify that you were actually Njobu's son." Jidaka nodded his head as he asked, "It's fine. I expected I would have to be tested. So what happens now?" Owibaya glanced at Bear as she said, "We have one small matter to deal with. Your friend Bear didn't come up when we looked for him. His face doesn't exist anywhere digitally, and the name Bear doesn't really help us much either." Jidaka looked over to Bear for a moment before he said, "He almost always wears his mask, and he doesn't normally travel in places that have working electricity, much less cameras to take his picture. Could you give us more info about him? His real name perhaps, and where he was born along with the year?" Jidaka glanced back at Owibaya as he said, "Give her your information, Bear." Owibaya looked at Bear as he said in a heavy Russian accent, "Mishka Medvedev, Yakutsk, USSR, October 12, 1963. Owibaya raised an eyebrow as she asked, "Doesn't that mean Bear in Russian?" Bear just smiled as Jidaka looked at Owibaya and asked, "You speak Russian?" All Dora Milaje are required to speak at least 5 languages fluently. I can speak 10. If you will excuse me for a little while, I need to run his information. She left the room right after. It took over half an hour before she came back to the room. She glanced at Bear before she looked at Jidaka and said, "Bear can join you, but he needs to be restrained." Jidaka nodded his head and said, "That's fine. Bear, let her cuff you." Bear grunted as he put his hands out. Owibaya came forward and put a small bead on each of Bear's wrist. Within a second, they each expanded and turned into a pair of heavy-duty handcuffs that magnetically locked his wrists together. Owibaya stepped back as she said, "The king and tribal leaders are awaiting you in the council chambers. Please follow me." Jidaka and Bear were led out of the room and back to the Royal Talon fighter. After they boarded the plane, they were treated to a beautiful view of the city. The city itself was beautiful and mixed technology with nature in a delicate balance. As they flew, other craft could be seen flying around the city, traveling from one area to another. Within a few minutes, they were taken to the heart of the city and a tall, beautiful golden spire. On each side of the spire stood tall onyx-colored panther statues. Each one was almost half the height of the spire itself. The aircraft landed in front of the spire on a large platform. As the aircraft opened its rear hatch, Jidaka and Bear were greeted by 10 women of the Dora Milaje. There were 5 women in a line to each side of the aircraft's ramp, standing at attention. Owibaya walked out onto the ramp and stopped to look at Jidaka as she said, "Follow me, and once inside the council chambers, do not speak unless you are asked to." Jidaka nodded his head before he and Bear silently followed Owibaya down the ramp. Once on the ground, the Dora Milaje formed up around them as they walked. Jidaka wasn't sure if they were considered prisoners or VIP guests with this type of treatment, but he decided to put his trust in Bear and his team that everything would be okay. As they walked through the spire, Jidaka took in the details of the place. It was a masterpiece of construction, but it was also a masterpiece of art. Everything flowed together organically and looked almost like it was natural. Even the things you could tell were man-made, somehow blended into the structure naturally. They were led to a unique elevator that was easily big enough to hold all of them. The elevator was stationed on the outside of the building and enclosed in glass. It was actually more of a single half-circle platform than what a typical elevator looked like, which gave it an amazing view of the beautiful city outside. Another interesting thing about the platform was how it operated. Since there were no walls, there were no buttons to push. Jidaka watched as Owibaya used the beads around her wrist, which showed a holographic display she used to control the elevator. As they rode the platform to the top of the spire, almost no motion was felt at all by anyone on the platform. Even though you could see the city becoming smaller below you, it made for a very strange and disconcerted feeling for Jidaka, which made him close his eyes. He took in a deep breath of air, then slowly exhaled it. When he reopened his eyes, they were already stopped at their destination. They exited the platform on the top floor and were guided to a set of tall, ornate double doors that opened up into a large, rounded meeting chamber. There was a reddish-brown platform in the middle of the room. It almost looked to be made of clay. Upon the clay platform rested 6 metal-colored chairs and a taller throne made out of metal and wood. The throne was at the back of the clay platform. It was a lot bigger compared to the other chairs and had 2 points coming out of the back near the armrests that reached up over the throne and stopped at points just before they connected with each other. On each side of the throne were 3 chairs in a row boxing in the sides of the clay platform. All of the chairs were currently filled with people. The man seated on the throne was older. His hair had started to become white, showing his advancing age. But he still looked strong and capable as a leader. His face was unreadable as he studied Njidaka and Bear as they approached the middle of the room. Njidaka's hands clenched slightly as he looked at the man who looked a lot like his father. A woman in the chair to the king's left was currently holding his hand. She showed no sign of her current age at all, if it wasn't for where she was seated and how she was interacting with the king. Njidaka would have thought she was a younger advisor instead of the queen. Everyone else seated in the chairs had a quiet and subdued demeanor. Njidaka took a moment to look at everyone as he came to a stop just before he stepped on the clay platform. The Dora Milaje who were guiding him spread out, but 4 of them stayed right behind him and Bear. Oibaya walked forward and stopped before the man on the throne as she said, "My king, I have bought Njidaka, son of Njobu, and his companion Bear as asked." She then stepped to the right side of the throne and took up her position next to it. The man was quiet for a few moments before he said in a deep voice, "Today is a day for celebration and also for mourning. Today my lost brother's son has returned and even brought us a gift. But his coming also brings news which we have feared for years, that my younger brother is dead." Bear, who stood behind Njidaka, noticed as the boy's fists clenched tighter the longer the king talked. Bear glanced around the room for a moment. He already knew this meeting wasn't going to follow the script. He only hoped that Eric didn't try to kill the king. It would just make things more complicated. 00054. Meeting a king. The king lowered his head, and everyone except for Njidaka and Bear followed suit. Njidaka gritted his teeth a little, but said nothing while he waited for everyone to finish. The whole room was quiet for a few minutes before the king started to raise his head as he said, "Njidaka, I am sorry for not bringing you home sooner. If I knew my brother had a son, then I would have gone to find you myself years ago." The tribal leaders and the queen nodded their heads in agreement with the king's statement. Njidaka only tightened his fists more as his fingernails started to dig into his palms. Bear seemed to be the only person who noticed Njidaka's reactions to the king's words. The king smiled as he said, "Njidaka, you have also done the country of your father's birth a great service by bringing us the criminal Ulysses Clow, someone who has escaped our grasp for years and was a master at evading us. For that you have mine and the rest of the country's thanks." King Chakra frowned slightly as he continued, "Unfortunately, you have also broken a taboo. You have told an outsider our secrets. Although we normally imprison people who break this taboo, we will overlook this issue since you weren't raised here. We will of course need to make sure Mr. Medvedev is the only person you told about Wakanda. After we are finished here, you will join Oibaya so she can ascertain if more people need to be detained." The king turned to look at Bear as he said, "Unfortunately for you, Mr. Medvedev, you will now have to be a permanent guest of Wakanda. You will be given a place to live, and we will assign you a job according to your skill set. You will also not be allowed to contact anyone outside of Wakanda." Njidaka frowned as he asked, "So he is now a prisoner of Wakanda?" The king glanced at Oibaya and she shot a glare at Njidaka from next to the king as she said, "You will only address the king if he asks you a question directly. Know your place, Njidaka." Njidaka shook his head as he said, "Nah, I don't think so. I am already tired of all this bullshit. I am gonna say my piece and then we are gonna dip." Njidaka glared at Oibaya and said, "And for the record, my name is Eric Stevens." All of the Dora Milaje looked like they wanted to attack Eric for his disrespect, before Chaka raised his right hand in the air as a calming signal. Chaka glowered at Eric as he said, "It seems you are just like your father. I had hoped you would be different, but it seems the apple didn't fall far from the tree." Chaka watched Eric, and he let out a sigh. Eric glared back at Chaka, until Chaka said, "You and your companion Bear are ordered to stay in Wakanda. You can never leave, and you will be watched at all times. If you try to leave, you will be forcefully detained and restrained. I am being lenient because you are my nephew, but I can treat you like anyone else if you test my patience, boy." As Chaka looked towards Oibaya, Eric started to laugh. Chaka instantly looked back at Eric with an angry glare as he said, "Stop laughing, boy, or you will regret it." Eric laughed more before he glared back at the king as he said, "What are you gonna do if I don't? Kill me like you did my father?" The whole room went quiet, as everyone looked at the king who hadn't reacted to the accusation. As they did, Bear unclipped his mask and slipped it onto his face. Some of the Dora Milaje and Chaka noticed his actions. Since Bear was already restrained and had no weapons, they paid him no mind. Chaka frowned at the young man in front of him and saw so much of his younger brother in the boy. Eric glared back at Chaka, his fists clenched so tight that his nails started to draw blood. Chaka finally spoke, and there was some heat in his voice as he said, "Your father was a traitor to Wakanda, and he was killed for it. I left you in Oakland because I knew you were going to be tainted by your father's ideals. You should have stayed away. There is nothing here for you." Chaka raised his right hand again as it looked like other people were going to talk and said, "We will talk after Njidaka and his companion are removed." "Owabaya, I want." "No. You will listen to what I have to say, and then we will leave." Chaka glared back at Eric as he said, "If he speaks again, I want him to be restrained and gagged." "Fuck you." As the Dora Milaje went to restrain Eric, a cloud of smoke appeared around Eric and Bear. When it cleared a second later, both of them were next to Chaka. Bear had a kunai to Chaka's throat and Eric seemed a little dazed. But Eric shook his head and then said, "Like I said, I'm going to say my piece and then we are leaving." Everyone was shocked at what just happened, including Oibaya, who looked at Bear like she wanted to slaughter him. Oibaya was slowly getting ready to attack Eric. She was confident that the king wouldn't have any issue handling Bear. He was still the Black Panther, and he should be able to react before the man was able to stab him with his weapon. Oibaya stopped when she felt a cold blade against her neck, and someone said in a playful tone of voice, "Let's not lose our heads now. Let the boy speak, and we will be on our way." Oibaya wasn't the only one who stopped moving. Everyone stopped moving because there were now 3 more people in the room wearing masks. A man with a cat mask was behind Oibaya. Another man in a crow mask was holding a blade to the queen's throat, and the last man in a wolf mask was standing next to Eric as a guard. Eric looked around at everyone and said, "Now that I have your undivided attention, I'm gonna say my piece." He pointed at Chaka on his throne while his hand dripped blood as he said, "You know I spent the last few years with only one goal, coming here to kill you and burn this place to the ground. You took everything I cared about away, so I plan to do the same to you." Eric grinded his teeth for a moment before he closed his eyes as he took a deep breath. He released it slowly before he opened his eyes and said, "As much as I still want to kill you, I won't. After meeting you, I realized you aren't worth killing. You're just a pathetic old man stuck in his ways and fearful of change. It's why you never listened to my father or tried to help him. It's why you killed him and left me in Oakland." Eric looked around at the other people in the room before he said, "All of you are just like him, stuck in traditions and afraid of change. One day you will wake up and realize that Wakanda isn't as great as you think it is. Sooner or later the rest of the world will catch up to Wakanda, and then what will you do?" Eric moved close to Chaka and bent down slightly next to his ear as he said, "I want you to look back on this day for the rest of your life and remember you are only alive because I allowed it." Eric stood back up and glanced at Bear as he said, "Let's get out of here. I am over this place." Bear nodded his head, and a few seconds later Eric and the 4 masked men faded away. As soon as they disappeared, the Dora Milaje took up positions around the king and queen along with the tribal leaders. Oibaya used the beads on her wrist and scanned the room to find where they went. She also sent messages to the main security center and told them to make sure the shield was up. She wouldn't let Eric and the men with him escape. When she was finished, she kneeled in front of the king who was holding his wife as she said, "My king, this was my fault. I take full responsibility for what happened." Chaka looked down at Oibaya and said, "Stand up, this isn't your fault. Whoever he had with him had technology on par with us. We need to figure out who they are and find out how they acquired that level of technology." The queen touched her husband's face with her hand that was shaking slightly as she asked, "Is that really the best idea? They could have killed us easily, but they didn't because Njata." Eric, I understand the need to keep us safe, but let's count our blessings and not provoke them for now. We first need to understand how they bypassed our security. Chaka was quiet for a few moments before he said, "I will heed your wisdom, love. We will focus on figuring out how they were able to get inside here and leave so easily." Owabaya looked around the room as she said, "I will talk with the research division and have them check over everything. We will figure out what happened and find a solution, my king." Chaka nodded his head and then let out a sigh as he said, "I guess I owe all of you the truth now. Go back to your positions, and I will tell you what happened with my brother." VVVVV. Eric, Ezekiel, and the others watched as Chaka started to tell everyone what really happened with his brother Njobu. Eric looked at Ezekiel, who had changed back into his normal-looking self, and said, "That didn't go the way I thought it would." Ezekiel patted Eric on the shoulder as he said, "Me either, but it's fine. I never expected to make friends with Wakanda this early." Ezekiel glanced at Eric as he asked, "Feel better after your rant?" Eric shrugged as he said, "Not really, but I will get over it." "Now what?" Ezekiel looked at Tao as he said, "Mind going to the storage facility? I want more vibranium." Tao let out a sigh before she said, "From a chauffeur to a getaway driver, and now a thief. I feel like my life has taken a turn for the worse since I met you. Are you saying you don't want any vibranium?" Tao opened a portal as she said, "No, I'll take some. It's a great conduit for making runic items." 00055. Finally, a new lead? Eric watched in slack-jawed fascination as Ezekiel and the three people with him quickly looted an entire storage room of its vibranium with the help of Tao's portals. Within 10 minutes, they cleared out an entire room, over 5 tons of vibranium. Even though Tao sounded reluctant to help at first, she was smiling while helping remove all the vibranium. About halfway through, Eric asked, "Shouldn't this place be guarded or have some type of alarm?" Ezekiel chuckled as he said, "You would think that, but Wakanda in its arrogance never thought that someone could even get here in the first place. There are monitors on the doors and cameras in the halls. But the storage rooms themselves have nothing. With how we left, aren't they going to know we stole all this vibranium?" Ezekiel grinned as he looked at Eric as he said, "Probably. That is why I am going to leave a note. It will throw them off." Eric and Tao had a dubious look as Ezekiel laughed and he said, "Trust me, they won't even see the note for like 6 months or more." When they were finished, Ezekiel left a note in the room that read, "To whom it may concern, the vibranium in this room was claimed by the rights of Finders Keepers. Since claimed under Finders Keepers law, if you wish to have it back, you must find it. With love, Fred." Once they were back at the base, and all the vibranium was added to what Ezekiel already took from Clow, Tao gave Ezekiel a questioning look as she asked, "Are you sure that was the best idea? Not only our display of power, but we also stole from them. On the tech side of things, they seem powerful. Should we be making Wakanda our enemy?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Tech-wise, they are powerful, but it's only because of their supply of vibranium. Honestly, their tech, while advanced, isn't that far ahead. Maybe 50 years, and the gap is closing fast. As for making them an enemy, everyone on that council is old, and you saw it from not just the king. They are too stuck in their traditions. Trying to make a deal with them properly most likely won't work. Aren't you being short-sighted?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Probably, but I am betting on the future king and his sister. I am going to monitor what happens in Wakanda for a while, but I am sure the king will keep what happened a secret. Whether he does or not, I plan to make contact with T'Challa and his sister at some point and introduce them to Eric. If we do anything with Wakanda, I want to be working with T'Challa, not Chaka." Ezekiel paused for a few moments before he said, "I do admit letting Eric speak might have been a bad idea, but I wouldn't change it. That kid has so much potential, and I don't want to see him waste it because of all of his anger. Letting him vent at his father's killer helped, along with his therapy session today." Tao glanced at the large pile of vibranium as she said, "Make sure you bring up Wakanda at the next meeting. The others should know about them and what happened." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I already have Sure Sway drafting a report for it. Anyways, I am going to go check on Eric. I will talk with you later." Tao nodded in reply as Ezekiel left her and his clones, and made his way to Eric's room to check up on him. When he got there, he found the door to the room open and Eric was laying on his bed. Eric was holding his father's ring above his head as he was studying it intently. Around this time, Fury sat up on the bed he was laying on in the holding cell. He looked a little pale and he had sweat on his forehead. He looked around the room for a moment before he checked his watch. After he noticed that almost 3 hours had passed, he said, "That motherfucker." He stood up and went out of the room to find Ezekiel. At the same time, Ezekiel walked in Eric's room as he said, "Penny for your thoughts?" Eric glanced at Ezekiel for a moment before he looked back at his father's ring. He was quiet as Ezekiel moved over to the only chair in the room and sat down. Eric sighed before he sat up on his bed to look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I figured you might want to talk a bit." Eric frowned as he said, "No." Eric then let out a sigh before he said, "Yes. That son of a bitch. He was just so arrogant." As Eric talked, his voice was rising as he said, "The more he talked, the more I wanted to punch him in his smug face. Everything that was coming out of his mouth was a lie, and it made me hate him." Eric chuckled at that as he said, "More than I already did. Your dad being a traitor wasn't a lie." Eric glared at Ezekiel for a moment before he let out a sigh as he said, "He was just trying to help people." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Maybe, but he was doing it in the wrong way. Did you know he planned to make a bomb using vibranium?" Eric looked a little shocked at that as he said, "My father wouldn't have done that." "You don't know your father as well as you think you do. While he did want to help people, violence isn't the only way to do things. Even if he wasn't going to use the bomb, just making it to use as a threat is a terrible idea. That's why I showed you what would happen if you followed his path." Eric frowned as he asked, "So using violence sometimes is the right way to do things?" Ezekiel nodded his head in reply, before Eric laughed as he said, "Doesn't that make you a hypocrite? You were the one who said I shouldn't follow my father's path, and yet now you are saying sometimes violence is the answer?" Ezekiel gave a self-deprecating laugh as he shrugged his shoulders and then said, "I probably am a hypocrite. You know I killed a lot of people recently." Ezekiel had a sad smile on his face, and after a long pause he said, "I would like to say it was for a good reason, a good cause, for something noble, but honestly it was because I didn't have a better choice." Eric didn't seem surprised as he studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he asked, "Wouldn't anything be better than death?" Ezekiel gave Eric a serious look as he said, "There are things far worse than death. But no, death was the best option out of what we came up with. I still don't like it myself, but sometimes when you have a choice to make, you don't really have a choice to make. Does that make sense?" Eric nodded his head a little as he said, "I get it. The way you worded it was bad, but I get it." They both stayed quiet for a few minutes before Ezekiel finally said, "So how do you want to move forward from here? Say the word and I can get you into any school you want. Honestly, you wouldn't even need my help. You could just ask Hank or Bill for a recommendation letter." Eric was quiet for a while as he looked at his father's ring again. When he tightened his fist over the ring, he asked, "You said you were going to change the world for the better. What if I decide to stay here, to join whatever it is you are doing here?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "We would be glad to have you. But what do you want to do if you join us?" "I want to fight. I saw what I could become if I trained. But I also want to help in other ways. I really like mechanical engineering. Would I be able to do both?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Yes, yes you can. I will talk with Hank and Darren. We will come up with a lesson plan to get you a master's degree in mechanical engineering and anything else that you might be interested in. At the same time, I will talk with Steve and Logan so they can start to give you combat training and a better physical training regimen overall." "Logan? Who is that?" Ezekiel had a puzzled look as he asked, "You haven't met Logan yet? He is here every few days to see Laura. He's kind of like her father." "That short, smelly guy is Laura's father?" Ezekiel laughed as he said, "That is definitely one way to describe him." Eric thought about it for a moment before he said, "I only really saw him once up close, but now that I think about it, Laura looks a lot like him." "Yup, she definitely took most of her genetics from Logan." Ezekiel gave a slight chuckle as he stood up. Ezekiel glanced over to Eric as he said, "You should get some sleep. It's been a long day, and I still have some stuff I need to do." Eric nodded his head but stayed sitting on his bed as he went back to looking at his father's ring. Ezekiel closed the door as he walked out of the room. He looked to the left of the door and asked, I suppose you want to have a talk too? Fury had a frown on his face as he nodded his head. He turned to his right and started to walk down the hallway, and Ezekiel followed along behind him. They didn't speak as they walked, but Ezekiel was fine with that. He wasn't really in a rush to find out how this conversation was going to go. After a few minutes, they made it to the main meeting room, and both of them sat down in their normal chairs. Ezekiel waited patiently until Fury said, You are a real son of a bitch. You know that? Ezekiel smirked as he said, Yup. Fury still had his frown as he asked, Are any of those things going to happen in this timeline? Are they what you are trying to prevent? In this timeline? I hope not, or we will be in trouble. Fury's frown turned into a glare as he said, Then why would you show me any of that? Ezekiel was a little surprised at the question and said, You know why? Fury scowled at Ezekiel as he raised his voice slightly as he said, Of course I do. You think you are clever? You think I will back off just because you showed me all the ways I could fuck up? No. I showed you what happens because you wouldn't put your trust in other people. I won't be like you. I just gave you some of my trust. Hopefully it wasn't misplaced. You didn't give me. Fury's face went through a range of emotions Ezekiel had never seen before. He almost looked happy, before his face schooled to its normal disappointed frown as he asked, How much of that will happen? Maybe 30% or so. Could be more, could be less. Fury was quiet for a few minutes as he started to think back over everything Ezekiel showed him. After a while, he looked at Ezekiel as he asked, So Stark's kid will become. An alarm went off in the room, and a second later, a screen popped up. It showed that some foreign diplomat was just assassinated. It also went to a live feed from a satellite, and it showed a man with a metal arm riding on a motorcycle. Ezekiel had a wide smile as he said, To answer your question, yes. Yes, he does. But now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Ezekiel smirked as he asked, Why? Because if I interfere, it might not happen. Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, Now you understand why I am trying not to fuck with the timeline too much? But you already have. Just bringing Steve out of the ice this early will have a big impact. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I already have a plan for that in place, but we can discuss that later with everyone else. But first I need to inform Steve and the others that I found Bucky. Fury nodded his head at that as he sat back in his chair and started to think over all the new information he gained from Ezekiel. He was trying to consolidate everything that happened in all of the worlds he saw first, then things that happened in most of them, then in half of them. He would still check out stuff that only happened in one world, but only after he confirmed if those people existed in this world. 00056, Wakanda and Eric. Ezekiel pushed a button, and the table in front of him opened up, showing a screen along with a keyboard and mouse. He started to type away on it for a few minutes before the main monitor of the room minimized Bucky riding a motorcycle to one side of the screen. It next pulled up a couple of boxes which said connecting in the middle of the box. After a few moments, one of the boxes changed. One of them showed Hank in his lab. In the background, you could see Bill and Darren talking in front of a computer. Hank looked at Ezekiel and Fury and asked, Did something happen? Ezekiel nodded as he said, Yes, we found Bucky. I am currently tracking him by satellite. We will be there in a few minutes. Ezekiel closed the screen afterwards, along with another screen that was meant to contact Bill. After a minute, another screen connected, and Tao could be seen on the screen. She had a slight smile as she asked, Does Fury want to talk about Wakanda? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, No, we finally found Bucky. I figured everyone would want to know. Tao nodded her head as she said, I will be there in a few minutes. As Ezekiel went to close the screen, another popped up with Peggy on it. She looked to be in bed and her hair was kind of a mess. Ezekiel smiled as he said, See you soon, Tao. He looked at the screen with Peggy and said, Sorry, didn't mean to wake you. It's fine, what happened? Ezekiel grinned as he said, We finally found Bucky. Steve could be heard outside of the frame as he asked, They found Bucky? Ezekiel and Fury were frozen after Steve talked. Peggy looked to her side for a moment, before she let out a sigh and turned the camera slightly. Steve was seated in the bed next to her. He was shirtless and his hair was a mess also. He smiled guiltily as he said, We will be there in a few minutes. The feed immediately cut off, and Ezekiel glanced at Fury as he asked, "They weren't. I don't even want to think about it." Ezekiel nodded his head before he started to giggle. His giggle turned into a full-on laugh, and even Fury started to smirk just the tiniest bit, before he schooled his face back to his normal half-frown. When Ezekiel calmed down, he said, "If you have any questions about what I showed you, just send me an email. Keep in mind that I don't know everything. So if you ask me for details on something, I probably don't know it." Fury had his computer up and was typing when he asked, "So what happened in Wakanda?" Ezekiel grinned as he said, "We stole 5 tons of vibranium." Fury's head snapped up to study Ezekiel for a few moments before he let out a sigh and said, "So now we are enemies with Wakanda?" "No, not really. I mean, maybe with the current leadership, but we will just make friends with the next king and everything should work out." Fury started to type again as he said, "Next time, can you at least inform us before you do something so stupid?" The door opened up and Hank and Bill walked in as Fury talked. Ezekiel said, "I will try my best, but sometimes things just happen." After Hank and Bill sat down, Hank asked, "What happened this time?" "Ezekiel stole 5 tons of vibranium from Wakanda, and now they might be our enemy." Hank turned from Fury and gave Ezekiel a questioning look as Bill said, "Wakanda? I've never heard of that place before." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Most people wouldn't know about them. Small country in the middle of Africa. From the outside, they seem like a small third-world country. But that is just what they show people. They are actually the most advanced country in the world." Hank looked a little upset as he said, "So what are we planning to do about Wakanda? I don't want to lose that vibranium. I will fight them if it comes to that." "No, we shouldn't have to fight them. We should be fine if we leave them alone and don't run around showing off we have vibranium. Honestly, just Eric will need to keep a low profile." Bill nodded his head as he said, "That is easy enough. I don't think we have any plans to make anything out of vibranium besides the quantum tunnel." The door opened up and in walked Peggy followed by Steve, who looked a little tense. So Ezekiel gave a wolf whistle, which made Steve smile slightly and caused Peggy to shoot Ezekiel a glare. Hank and Bill smiled just a tiny bit as Fury shook his head. As Peggy and Steve were sitting down, Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I am not going to pry into your personal business, but I just want to say don't break a hip or something." Peggy glared at Ezekiel as Steve turned a little red. Hank and Bill both laughed for a moment before Peggy glared at them. She then looked back at Ezekiel as she said, "Are you done?" As Ezekiel nodded his head, Tao walked in the door. Once she took her seat, Ezekiel gestured to the main monitor as he said, "They used Bucky to assassinate a foreign dignitary who was pretty outspoken about the current climate in Symkaria. We will have to assume that they have a hand in what is happening there." Fury nodded as he said, "I will send someone from our group to investigate his death and see if we can dig up anything." Steve watched the monitor intently as he asked, "When are we going after Bucky?" Fury looked up at Steve and Peggy as he said, "Right after we find where they are keeping him. But since everyone is here, let's talk about what Ezekiel did in Wakanda while we wait." Everyone turned to look at Ezekiel, who smiled as he said, "I will try to make this quick." He started to type on his computer, which made the satellite view of Bucky smaller. A new screen popped up, and it showed a satellite view of Wakanda. It looked mostly covered in jungle, and there were only a handful of towns that could be seen in the image. Ezekiel pointed at the screen as he said, "This is Wakanda, a small, isolationist, landlocked country located in Africa. It's a third-world nation that is known for its exports of textiles, at least what they show to the outside world." The screen zoomed into a random part of Wakanda that seemed to be covered in jungle. After Ezekiel typed on the computer some more, the jungle disappeared and they could see a sprawling metropolis. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "This is the Golden City, also known as Bernin Zana, the capital of Wakanda. They are the most technologically advanced civilization currently on Earth, and it's because they are sitting on a meteor full of vibranium." The screen pulled up some pictures. It was the family tree of the Golden Tribe. Eric's picture was near the bottom, and Ezekiel pulled it up as he said, "Eric Stevens Ornjadaka is the son of former Prince Njobu. When I talked to him the other day, I realized I messed up pretty badly. I should have talked with him as soon as he was brought under our custody." Some police crime scene photos came up on the screen as Ezekiel said, "Njobu was killed by his brother, the current king of Wakanda, and Eric was left behind to fend for himself, partly to hide the fact the king killed his brother." and partly to keep the royal bloodline pure since Eric is only half Wakanda. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "When he was brought in, I knew Eric had some issues and would work towards his main goal of revenge against his father's killer. But when I met him, he seemed normal, so I put off talking with him. I was hoping I wouldn't have to deal with his issues, and that maybe just bringing him here would help to change him. I am sure everyone else thought the same thing as me. He never showed any outward signs or issues." Ezekiel typed on his computer for a moment and brought up a video of him talking to Eric the other day. After the video finished, Steve said, "You were right. I was with him a lot and I never noticed his anger." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "He hid it well, but it has now been dealt with. That being said, I took him to Wakanda and let him talk with the king." Another video came up and played everything that happened in the council room. Once finished, Peggy said, "That wasn't that bad. No one was killed. It's not like we can't reach out and negotiate with them." Hank shook his head as he said, "They also stole 5 tons of vibranium." Peggy turned to glare at Ezekiel as she said, "Why the hell would you do that?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "We could use it, but now we have to deal with a powerful new enemy." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No. If they do anything, they will be looking for Eric and a person who doesn't exist. Plus, I want Eric to become friends with his cousin and the future king of Wakanda. Then we won't have to worry about any real fallout." "Maybe." Fury glanced up from his computer as he asked, "So what are we going to do with Eric then?" Ezekiel smiled as he looked over to Fury as he said, "He wants to join us. We will need to train him up, but he will be a great asset." Steve shook his head as he said, "No, I don't agree with that. I don't mind the gym class we are doing, but I won't train kids to fight." "That's fine. I can have one of my agents do it." Steve looked over at Fury as he said, "No, we shouldn't be training kids to fight. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war." Steve looked at Tao as he said, "We are talking about training kids to fight, to kill." Tao nodded her head as she said, "You were a kid when you went to war." Steve shook his head as he said, "I was in my 20s already. Like I said, you were a child. Eric made a choice to join us. We should respect that choice and treat him like an adult." Steve looked like he was going to disagree when Ezekiel said, "Steve, if it was normal kids, I would agree. But all of the kids we brought in are here for a reason. If we didn't bring in Eric, he would have gone to MIT, and after he graduated, he would have joined the Navy SEALs and earned the nickname Killmonger." Ezekiel typed on his computer and pulled up a picture of Grant Ward. Ezekiel looked back at Steve as he said, "Grant is here because he would have been picked up by Hydra and made a sleeper agent in S.H.I.E.L.D. if we didn't collect him. Every kid we have here can be great assets to us, but like I told Fury about Cecily, I will never force any of them to join us." Ezekiel let out another sigh as he said, "I told Eric, say the word and I will get him into any college he wants. He said he wanted to join us and fight. You can talk to him about it if you want, but I doubt you can change his mind." Ezekiel looked over at Hank as he said, "Eric also wants to learn mechanical engineering. I told him we would come up with a lesson plan to get him a degree in it." Hank smiled as he said, "Sounds good to me. I will talk to Darren later about it. We can come up with a lesson plan and even give him experience helping out in the lab." Ezekiel looked back at Steve as he said, "I was hoping you and Logan would train Eric, but I won't try to force you to do something you aren't comfortable with." Steve shook his head as he said, "I still don't like the idea, but it looks like if I don't do it, someone else will. I will talk with Eric, and if I can't talk him out of it, then I will train him. The same goes for the other kids if they decide to join us." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Sounds go to me. What about everyone else?" Everyone agreed. So Ezekiel pulled up the satellite feed of Bucky again. He had made it to some deserted area and was waiting. Ezekiel started to type again, and after a minute another image came up. It was a small jet flying. Ezekiel looked up as he said, "It looks like this is his ride. We just need to track this, and we should find where they have been hiding him and the others." 00057. Bucky rescued. Even though it was late, Ezekiel and the others decided to go over other issues and projects while they waited. After 2 hours, Hank and Bill left. They weren't really needed for the next part and wanted to keep working on the quantum tunnel. Tao also left not long after and said to contact her when they were ready to go. Fury ended up leaving once he received a call from Hill. He needed to take care of some issues back at S.H.I.E.L.D. Peggy also left, and said to contact her if something important came up. Once Steve and Ezekiel were alone, Ezekiel said, "You don't need to wait here. I will contact you once I find their base." Steve shook his head as he said, "It's fine. I'm not really tired." About Bucky, how are you going to fix his brainwashing? Ezekiel grinned as he said, "Same way I fixed Laura's trigger scent issue and Eric's anger issues. It shouldn't be that hard. It might take a day or so." Steve nodded his head but looked a little relieved. They enjoyed a comfortable silence as Steve watched the jet and Ezekiel worked on his computer. After a few more hours, the jet landed at some base in the middle of northern Siberia. Ezekiel looked up and watched as Bucky walked out of the jet and went inside the base. The jet took off right after, and the entrance to the base closed back up. From the angle of the satellite's view, the base disappeared completely. Even the landing pad for the transport didn't look like anything. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I knew there was a reason I couldn't find this place with all the satellites I have." Ezekiel played back the footage with the entrance open, and it was still extremely hard to tell anything was there. Ezekiel typed on his computer for a few moments before he looked at Steve as he said, "Let's go meet Tao and Kaiselius to scout the base. You want to bring both of them?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Yes, I want both of them with us when we take the base." They both walked in silence as they went to the portal transfer station of the base where they met Tao and Kaiselius. Tao pulled everyone into the mirror dimension before she made a portal to the front of the hidden base. Standing at ground level on the landing pad, you could easily make out the front of the base. But it was still well hidden since the closest settlement was over 200 miles away. This place was also considered restricted because the USSR did nuclear weapons tests in the area at some point. Honestly, Ezekiel was impressed. He had scanned this area before and never noticed anything here or in the records he found. It took them a few hours, but they scouted the whole place pretty easily from the mirror dimension. They infected the main servers with Ezekiel's program, which uploaded a copy of all their files to his hidden network. When Bucky was found, Steve ended up staying there to watch his friend for a while. It seemed a little creepy to Ezekiel, but he wasn't going to say anything about it in front of Steve. After they had collected everything they needed, Ezekiel and the others went back to their base to make a plan and collect Ezekiel's other clones. It went quickly enough, and within an hour they were back at the base. The plan was simple. They took control over the main security room. Then Ezekiel's clones blitzed through the whole base, putting everyone in a special timed release genjutsu. The genjutsu was actually custom-made for large groups of people, but it required everyone to be affected, or it would fail. Once they had finished, Ezekiel and his team took some samples from the super soldiers, removed all important documents, files, and records. Kaiselius helped Steve take Bucky back to base to begin his deprogramming. Then Ezekiel, Tao, and the base commander Colonel Vasily Karpov stayed behind in the communications room while they waited for the genjutsu to go off. After half an hour, everyone moved. The super soldiers were already thawed out and started to attack everyone in sight. Everyone else responded to the attack. The alarms were going off, and every available soldier was rushing to contain the super soldiers. Colonel Vasily Karpov's eyes moved around wildly as he walked past Ezekiel to an encrypted radio. He picked up the receiver and punched in some numbers before he said, "This is Special Base L73, L96. I am Base Commander Colonel Vasily Karpov. Emergency Code Sierra 5, 7, Delta 3, Romeo, Golf 1, 8, India, Kilo, Oscar 6, 9, Whiskey 4, Zulu." After a few seconds the line connected and a man said, "What happened, Commander Karpov?" Vasily sounded a little panicked as he said, "The super soldiers are free and rampaging throughout the base. I am requesting assistance to help contain them." The line went quiet for a few moments before another person came on and said, "How did the super soldiers get free? They should have been in hibernation." Vasily's voice still had a hint of panic, but he calmly said, "Dr. Nagel wanted some new samples from the super soldiers. He said he had a breakthrough and wanted to run some tests with new samples. We were careful, but they broke free and attacked. We have lost the Winter Soldier, Dr. Nagel, and about 30 other personnel so far. I will send you reinforcements, but it will take at least 3 hours before they arrive. You need to keep them contained until they arrive, and make sure you back up Dr. Nagel's reset." Another different alarm started going off as Vasily said, "Fuck, Someone overloaded the reactor. Forget the base and everyone else. Just get Dr. Nagel's research and get out. I should have a rescue team there in an hour for you. Roger. Vasily hung up the receiver and then started to move out of the room before Ezekiel stopped him with a new Jinjutsu that knocked him out. He picked him up and glanced at Tao, who nodded her head and pulled them into the mirror dimension. They waited for about 5 minutes before the base erupted in a massive explosion. The main outside structure of the base somehow survived, but the inside of the base was ruined completely. Ezekiel and Tao walked through the devastation for a while to make sure nothing important survived the blast. They checked where the servers were, the secure safe in Vasily's office, and a few other spots. Nothing was left besides wreckage. Ezekiel and his clones had already removed everything important and wiped the servers. But Ezekiel wanted to double-check that everything was still destroyed. It would be weird if something was found in good shape yet it was empty. After they confirmed everything and checked the outside of the base, they portaled to the cloning facility. Ezekiel left Vasily in one of the cells, and then they portaled to the main base. Ezekiel checked in on Eno and her father, who were already working on Bucky, while Steve watched over his friend. Fury, Coulson, Hill, Hank, and Peggy were currently going over all the physical documents that were recovered. Ezekiel joined them after checking in with Steve. He used his computer and started to sort through everything that was on the base's servers. Hours passed as they worked, and it soon became morning. After a while, Steve walked into the room and smiled brightly as Bucky walked in behind him. The thing most people noticed first was his metal arm with a red star on it. Bucky stood a few inches shorter than Steve, while his dark brown hair was loose and stopped at his shoulders. His brown eyes looked haunted, but there was also a spark of relief in them. Steve looked at everyone in the room as he said, "Bucky, this is part of the team I have been working with." Steve started to point out everyone to Bucky, and when he got to Peggy, he said, "You remember Peggy Carter?" Bucky looked at her for a moment before he said, "You aged well, Peggy." "Steve agrees with you on that one." Peggy glared at Ezekiel for a moment before Steve said with a smile, "That is Ezekiel. He is the main reason we are all here. He also likes to joke around a little too much." Bucky nodded towards Ezekiel as he said, "Thanks for the rescue and for fixing my head." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Glad to help. I am sure you wouldn't mind some rest. Steve can show you to some temporary quarters you can use." Bucky shook his head as he said, "Thanks, but with my head clear for the first time in ages, I don't feel like resting. I want to make amends." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "I can understand that. What do you want to do?" Bucky frowned a little as he said, "When I was under control, they mostly used me for assassinations. But they also sent me to this place called the Red Room a few times. They had me training girls in hand-to-hand combat. I think they were training the girls to be assassins." Ezekiel sounded excited as he asked, "You know where the Red Room is located?" Bucky nodded his head as he said, "You have a map?" Fury glanced at Ezekiel as he said, "If we do something to the Red Room now, won't that ruin the timeline?" Ezekiel paused for a few moments before he said, "Probably." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Let's find the place and check it out. After that, I will talk with Tao about trying something before we make a move." Fury nodded his head in agreement, and everyone else but Bucky seemed surprised because he didn't argue with Ezekiel for a change. Ezekiel typed on his computer before a map of Europe and Asia popped up on the main monitor of the room. Bucky studied it for a few moments before he said, "It's located in Belarus, just a little north of a city called Minsk." The view changed as Ezekiel typed on the computer and zoomed in on Minsk. After a few moments, a current satellite view of a compound was on the screen. It didn't really look like much from the outside, just a big walled-off area with a few buildings. Ezekiel started to look into the building and found nothing that stood out about it. Bucky nodded his head as he said, "I never saw it from this angle, but I am sure that's it. The way the wall is oddly shaped around the outside, the way those buildings are laid out." Ezekiel looked over to Steve as he said, "Go grab Shursway and the others. I am going to dispel and let my main body know what is going on. I will have Tao and Kaiselius meet you in the portal room to go scout the place with Bucky." Ezekiel pulled out a USB drive and tossed it to Steve as he said, "You know what to do with that. Once it's in place, I will start my side of things from here. Once you guys are done, we will plan out what to do next." Ezekiel typed on his computer for a few moments before he turned into a puff of smoke. Bucky glanced at Steve as he asked, "What just happened?" Steve patted Bucky's shoulder as he said, I will tell you about it as we go grab the others. It was 20 minutes later when Steve, Bucky, and Ezekiel's clones arrived at the portal room. Ezekiel, Tao, Kaiselius, and a few more clones of Ezekiel were already there waiting for the others. Ezekiel finished talking with Tao as he waved at Steve and the others as he said, Good luck, everyone. I will monitor you guys from here. Steve nodded as he said, Thanks, we will see you soon. Tao pulled everyone into the mirror dimension as Ezekiel went back to the room Fury and the others were using. About 10 minutes later, Ezekiel's computer started to beep before he typed some stuff on it and connected into the Red Room servers. He started to back up their servers before he started to look through the files from the Winter Soldier base. A few more hours passed before Steve and the others returned. When they did, everyone except Ezekiel and his clones took a break to go eat a late breakfast. When they came back, Steve and Bucky both voiced their desire to launch a rescue for all the girls currently in the Red Room. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, Trust me, I want to help them just as much as you do. But I want to make sure the timeline won't be destroyed if we do this. Bucky was the only one who was confused as he asked, Fury, and you talked about that before we left. What does that mean? Ezekiel made a few hand signs before he looked at Bucky. Bucky relaxed in his seat a little as his eyes lost focus. Ezekiel smiled as he said to Steve, giving him a fast crash course on us and what we are trying to do. He should be done in half an hour or so. As Steve nodded in reply, Ezekiel looked at Tao as he said, Do you think my idea will work? Tao nodded her head as she said, It has merit and might work, but we would need your real body to try it. Ezekiel nodded in agreement as he said, Well, no time to waste then. Go to the portal room and I will have one of my clones meet you there. Tao nodded as she got up and left the room as Ezekiel typed away on his computer for a few moments. Ezekiel looked back up at everyone as he said, Let's wait for Bucky, and then we can talk about a possible rescue operation. Till then, have you found anything interesting in the Winter Soldier files? 00058. Testing an idea to see the future. Tao met Itachi at the portal room and pulled him into the mirror dimension before she made a portal to go get Theo. They appeared in Aunt May's house and found Theo in the living room reading a book. Tao moved right next to Theo before she started a spell and then whispered into his ear, It's time to switch. Theo placed his book down on the couch and then walked towards the back of the house towards the bathroom. After he closed the door, he was pulled into the mirror dimension where Itachi tapped his forehead, transferring information. Itachi then transformed into Theo, and Tao put him back into the real world. A portal was then opened to Kamar Taj, and Theo, who was now transformed into Ezekiel, walked through it with Tao. As Ezekiel followed Tao, he asked, So what are the chances of this working? Tao smirked as she said, 60%, probably less. Yao and the others before him never tried it to my knowledge. But your theory does have merit though, so I am willing to try it out. I assume the idea was from comics you have read? Ezekiel smiled back as he said, Actually no, it wasn't. It just made sense that the future is cloudy because the one above all wanted to hide me. But if I try to look into the future, I should be able to see it clearly because I can't hide from myself. I think. Tao nodded her head in understanding, and they fell into silence as they walked. They walked through dimly lit hallways till they made it to the inner sanctum where the Eye of Agamotto was kept. Tao released the seals, keeping it in place, and took it with her as she walked to her room with Ezekiel. Once they made it to Tao's room, she set up 2 patterns on the floor. The first pattern was large and shaped like a star burst inside a circle with an inverted triangle on the outside of it. The tip of that triangle connected to a smaller circle which had another star burst pattern in the middle of it. She directed Ezekiel to sit in the smaller pattern as she sat in the other one and said, Remove your transformation. I am not sure how it will affect the spell. Ezekiel nodded his head and dispelled his hinge. Theo looked back at Tao, who began to weave her hands in a pattern as she chanted, Unconnected become connected. My eyes become your eyes. As she chanted, the starburst patterns lighted up and started to pulse slightly. Tao lifted the Eye of Agamotto as she said, Show us what the future possibly holds. Allow us to see our future mistakes before we make them. She unlocked the Eye of Agamotto, and the entire pattern ignited in orange and green before both Tao and Theo went into a trance as a sphere of orange and green enveloped them. Theo looked around himself for a few moments, He was floating in a dark space with the only light coming from different clouds floating around in the distance. Each cloud was like a rainbow of color that had a picture in the middle of it. The pictures were blurry and would switch randomly. Each one was a single moment in time that was frozen. Beautiful, isn't it? Theo turned to the voice to see Tao floating next to him. She was ethereal, and he could see the clouds floating behind her through her body. He nodded his head as he said, "It almost reminds me of when I met the person who sent me here. It makes me feel small, like I don't really matter." Tao nodded her head as she said, "Not all people who discover magic feel the same way. It's good that it humbles you. It's another reason you should learn magic. You won't take it for granted." Theo frowned slightly as he said, "I still have so much I need to learn about my own powers. I have barely scratched the surface of them. If I have to learn magic, it will just take me longer to master my own powers, and I honestly don't want to read a bunch of old magic books." "A pity. You would make such a great student." Tao looked around for a few moments and then said, "First, we should make sure that Strange comes to Kamar Taj. If not, we will have to adjust things to make sure it happens." A cloud moved closer to them, and as it approached them, it flickered rapidly through different pictures before it stopped on a man in scrubs. The man appeared arrogant, like everyone around him wasn't that important. As the cloud stopped in front of them, Tao said, "Let's see what your actions have caused for the timeline." As they watched the cloud, it quickly played through events that were similar to the movie. But after the accident, when Strange was trying to find any way to heal his hands, Theo hurriedly asked, "Can you pause it?" The cloud paused on Strange talking to a man in a warehouse he was very familiar with. "Pangborn works for my dad?" Tao nodded her head as she said, "Yes. I was a little surprised when I went to speak with him, but it turns out he used to work for your father and Ben before his accident." Theo glanced away from the frozen picture for a moment as he asked, "You went to speak with him?" "Yes, just after I met you. I had sent him out of Kamar Taj with a mission to find you, but it turned out I didn't need to." Theo shook his head as he said, "Yeah, Fury helped you out with that. I still don't see how you and Fury even knew each other. It never happened in the main MCU or in a lot of comics. We ran into each other a few times over the years, and I decided to exchange emails with him. A quirk of fate in this timeline, I think." Theo smirked as he said, "Yeah, you baldies need to stick together." Tao flicked out her hand and smacked the back of Theo's head hard, which made him start to flip over forward extremely fast as he floated in space. He grabbed the back of his head as he said, "Why the hell does that hurt?" "Because you have no respect." Theo rubbed the back of his head as he continued to rotate around. After a few more moments, he asked, "How do I even stop this?" Tao reached out again and Theo's forehead slammed into the back of her hand. It caused his rotation to stop, but he started to rub his forehead now. Theo glared at Tao for a moment before he looked back at the cloud in front of them. It hadn't actually paused, but was moving in slow motion. As he watched, he noticed something in the background behind Pangborn and Strange and asked, "Can we change angles or zoom in?" Tao flicked her right hand out and then pinched two fingers together, which made the image zoom past Strange. In the back corner of the warehouse stood two young men who were talking and looking into the engine bay of a car. As the view focused on them, one of the young men with black hair raised his hand behind the other person's back and gave a thumbs up. "Wait, I can tell we are watching?" "Yes, I still have no idea how you can do that though. Maybe something to do with how you were brought here." Tao frowned slightly as she finished talking. Tao moved her hands and the images sped up again as she said, "Let's get back on track. This is more taxing than normal, and we have much to check." Theo nodded his head as they watched Strange on his journey to learn magic. Time passed quickly for them as they looked for different things that might have been affected by Theo's actions. From events with Thor, Tony, Hydra, and many others. As they watched different timelines, time passed outside in the real world. The light from outside the room slowly brightened as neither moved inside the sphere of orange and green that swirled around them. Master Hammer arrived at some point with some tea and breakfast. After he watched the orange and green sphere for a little while, he set up the tea and food on the table. He then placed a stasis spell to keep the food and tea fresh for Tao and her guest. It was past noon when the sphere collapsed to release Tao and Theo. Theo looked a little out of it and continued to stay seated as Tao got up. Tao released the spell over the table and poured 2 cups of tea. She waited for a few minutes before Theo finally stood up and recast his hinge as he said, "That was different." Tao nodded her head as she said, "It was a little weird, but not much different than when I used the Eye of Agamotto alone." Ezekiel sat down next to Tao and picked up one of the cups of tea. He took a sip before he said, "I'm not a fan of tea, but this is enjoyable." Tao nodded her head, but before she spoke, Ezekiel grinned as he said, "Yes, I know. You know." Tao gave Ezekiel a flat look before he smiled brightly as he said, "I couldn't help myself. Anyways, so at least we know it works now." Tao frowned a little as she said, "Yes, but I am not sure if we should rely on it. It was very taxing to keep up the spell with 2 people. I will need to rest for a while to recover properly." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I just wanted to make sure the timeline wouldn't be ruined. Now that we know, we shouldn't need to do this again. It was kind of fun to see certain things always happen though." Tao smiled as she said, "It's good to know Strange will still come to Kamar Taj." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "And that Tony will become Iron Man." Tao drank some more tea before she said, "Do you want to eat before we go back?" Ezekiel looked over the food on the table before he said, "Sounds good to me." 00059. A deciding vote. After they ate, Tao took Ezekiel back home so he could switch places with his clone. He also made sure to share his memories with Itachi before they switched. Tao took Itachi back to the base where he shared the memory packet with Ezekiel, who was in the meeting room with everyone else. Once finished, Ezekiel smiled as he said in a completely different voice than normal, "Good news, everyone." Everyone seemed a little confused at Ezekiel's statement and the weird old man voice he used. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Never mind." Ezekiel scratched the back of his head for a moment before he said, "It worked. We can go ahead with the mission." Bucky and Steve looked relieved, but Fury frowned as he asked, "What about Romanoff? Won't this ruin the timeline for her?" Ezekiel grinned as he said, "She will be fine. Actually, she will be better than before." Everyone else besides Tao was a little lost as Steve asked, "Mind filling the rest of us in? Who is Romanoff?" Ezekiel typed on his computer and a profile for a young girl came up. She had her hair dyed blue and bright green eyes. It displayed her full name as Natalia Alienovna Natasha Romanova. Ezekiel pointed at the screen as he said, "In a different timeline, she becomes one of the world's best assassins before she turned into one of the world's heroes. She is currently in the Red Room program along with her adoptive sister Yelena Belova." Steve frowned a little as he asked, "Are you planning to train her?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Yes, if that is what she wants. If you don't want to help, that's fine. But keep in mind, Romanova and the other girls we rescue from the Red Room are coming here, and they have been trained for years to be assassins and spies. I will have my clones help deprogram them, but if they want to join us, I won't tell them no." Steve looked upset as he was going to speak again, but Bucky placed his hand on Steve's shoulder as he said, "I know how you think. You want those girls to have a normal life. But those girls are anything but normal. We might be able to help the youngest ones to have a normal life. But the girls who have been there for years are already trained killers. But they should have a chance at a normal life also." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "And I will offer them that chance, but I won't force them to live a normal life if they don't want to." Steve still looked unhappy as Ezekiel said, "I know you aren't happy with training kids, but just pulling them out of the Red Room is keeping them alive." Ezekiel typed on his computer, and some files popped up on the screen. They showed how many girls had been brought into the program over the years and the number of graduates it had. The number was less than 1% of more than 10,000. Everyone was surprised at the low number, and Peggy asked, "Why is it so low?" Ezekiel pulled up a video on the screen. It showed 2 young girls as they talked with each other happily. The video cut and the same girls were displayed, but both of them looked a little older, and they were fighting each other. Both of them were covered in wounds and bleeding heavily. One girl lagged behind in her defense, and the other girl was able to plunge a knife into her throat. The winner stood over the other girl as she watched her bleed out. The video cut out as Ezekiel said, "They pair the girls up with a friend, and after a few years they make them fight to the death. They take the winners and do it again with other winners. It's terrible, but also the most effective way to make them obey without question. The last thing they do is to sterilize the girls for their graduation, so they are even more loyal." Ezekiel looked at Steve as he said, "I will do what I can to help them, but I can only do so much. From what Tao and I saw, almost every one of those girls joins us. Tao nodded her head in agreement as she said, what Ezekiel said is true. Only a handful of girls didn't want to fight. But those few still joined us and helped in other ways. Peggy reached over and clasped Steve's hand as she said, I know how you feel, but this is the best outcome for these girls. Steve nodded his head in defeat as he said, I know. I just wish it wasn't. Ezekiel took a moment before he said, on to less depressing issues. We already scouted and planned out the rescue mission. The only real issue is housing, which I have my clones currently working on to expand the base to add more rooms. Ezekiel typed on his computer, and the screen pulled up a camera feed which showed his clones currently working on making new rooms with Earth Jutsu and then reinforcing them. Ezekiel looked at everyone as he said, they should be finished by tomorrow for the rough layout. I had them placed by the gym area. As for the plumbing, electrical, flooring and the rest, that will be done in a few days once Koenig has all the supplies for my clones. Jarvis spoke next as he said, we will also need to start stocking more food and get some more kitchen help. The kids have been wonderful, but I could really use a competent helper or two for food preparation. Does anyone know someone we might be able to bring in? From the look of it, we will have at least 100 new mouths to feed. Peggy shook her head as she said, unfortunately, I do not know anyone who could work under our special circumstances. She looked at Fury when she was done talking. Fury also shook his head as he said, I don't have anyone in S.H.I.E.L.D. who could fill the role currently. As he finished, Peggy looked at Tao. I could spare someone to help part-time, but they mostly cook Asian dishes. Ezekiel smiled at that before he said, I can have 2 of my clones help out. They are amazing cooks, but since they are clones they can't taste anything, which is why I never offered before. But they should be able to help out a lot with the prep work. Jarvis nodded his head in thanks as Bucky asked, so when are we going to rescue those kids? Ezekiel typed on his computer for a moment before he looked up as he said, in about a week. I want to make sure we have everything ready to support them. Unfortunately, we are late with our rescue. They just did their testing of the girls 3 months ago. Everyone frowned at the news before Ezekiel said, during this week, we also need to try and recruit a few people who can help us. He typed on his computer, and a few pictures appeared on the screen. Fury was the first to react as he said, are you out of your mind? Those people are enemies. Peggy nodded her head as she said, I have to agree with Fury. Ezekiel glanced back at Fury and Peggy as he asked, who exactly are they enemies with? Fury frowned as he said, with us. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I never had a confrontation with them before, and as far as I know they don't even know we exist. Fury and Peggy both looked displeased, but it was Hank who said, I remember fighting one of them before when I was still in S.H.I.E.L.D. Ezekiel nodded as he said, I could see that since the USSR never joined the World Security Council. But we aren't S.H.I.E.L.D., so we should try to make contact and recruit them. Fury still looked upset as he said, how will we even vet them? I am going to use my clones for that. That way I can make sure there won't be any issues. I am confident in recruiting 2 of them, since in almost every future we looked at, they were with us. The other 2 joined us also, but it wasn't as consistent. Fury and Peggy still looked reluctant, so Ezekiel said, fine, let's vote on it. All in favor? The vote count was split dead even, with Tao, Ezekiel, Steve and Jarvis who voted for it, while Fury, Peggy, Bill, and Hank voted against it. Ezekiel looked a little disappointed as Bucky asked, I know I am new, but do I get to vote? Ezekiel looked at Bucky for a moment before he looked at everyone else. Peggy shared a conversation with Fury from just a momentary glance. She then looked at everyone else for a moment before she said, I don't think anyone has an issue with it. Great. I vote for trying to recruit them. 00060. First 2 recruits. After the vote was passed, the meeting finished up pretty quickly. Ezekiel, along with Tao, started making a plan on who they were going to try and recruit. They planned to recruit them in a certain order to have the best chance of getting them all. The first person they needed to recruit was currently living in Russia and was working for the Red Room. They worked away from the main base and were stationed just outside of St. Petersburg at a small farm. A portal appeared at the farm while inside the mirror dimension. Out of it stepped Ezekiel, followed by Tao. They looked around the area for a few moments before they moved inside the house. Once inside, Ezekiel connected a USB into a server stack located in the basement and took over the computer network and security system. Once finished, he set it to loop the security footage and then went upstairs with Tao to look around. Ezekiel wanted to find a specific item, a photo album. Once he found it, he waited patiently in a corner of the living room as he slowly looked through it while sitting in a chair. Tao also waited around, but she was hidden in the mirror dimension. Over an hour passed before the front door opened and a woman walked inside. At first glance, it seemed that she didn't notice anything amiss. But after she placed her overcoat on the rack, she spun around quickly with a gun in her hand and pointed it at Ezekiel. Ezekiel never looked up as he continued to calmly look through the photo album. The woman waited a few moments, but when she didn't get a reaction from the man, she asked, "Who sent you?" Ezekiel finally glanced up at the woman, before he looked back at the photo album as he said, "Technically, I sent myself." Ezekiel flipped a page as he said, "You know, I find it weird that a woman like you would keep a family photo album from a spy mission." Ezekiel slowly lifted up the album and pointed at a picture as he said, "This man was never married to you, and these two girls aren't even related to you. Well, I guess once they graduate from the Red Room, you could consider them unofficially your daughters." The woman tensed at Ezekiel's statement, but did nothing else. Ezekiel closed the album and set it aside as he said, "Melina, I just want to talk for a bit and give you a job offer. If you don't like the offer, I will leave, and you will never see me again." Melina finally moved as she aimed the weapon closer to Ezekiel's head than his chest like before. She stepped a little closer as she said, "You won't be going anywhere." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "You don't have the power to stop me, and the beacon you activated isn't going to bring anyone to help you." As soon as Melina pulled the trigger on her weapon and the sound of the shot rang out, Ezekiel disappeared in a cloud of smoke. As the smoke cleared, she could see on the chair was her overcoat, and Melina could feel the cold edge of a knife on her throat. Ezekiel's voice could be heard behind her as he said, "I just want to talk. Give me an hour of your time, please." As the knife slowly moved away from her throat, Melina spun around and fired her gun 3 times before she realized no one was there and a salt shaker was on the ground. She heard the man from her kitchen as he said, "I just want an hour of your time, so we can talk like civilized people." Melina moved towards her kitchen and saw the man seated at her kitchen table with a smug smile on his face and the photo album sitting on the table next to him. The man pointed to another seat as he said, "You can try to shoot me again, which will get you nowhere. Or we can talk like adults for an hour." Melina eyed the man warily, but holstered her weapon before she grabbed a teapot and started to fill it with water. Ezekiel waited patiently as he watched her before she finally said, "If you are here to talk, then talk." Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "Let me ask you a question to start. What do you want out of life?" Melina paused for only a moment before she said, "I have everything I need. Why would I need anything more?" "Are you sure about that? This photo album I found makes me think otherwise." Minutes passed before Melina pulled the steaming teapot from the stove and poured water into 2 cups inside of which she had set a tea bag each. She walked over to the table and set a cup in front of Ezekiel before she placed the other in front of another chair. She then pulled out some milk, sugar, honey, and set them all on the table. She started to mix a little milk and honey into her tea as she said, "You have already wasted 5 minutes." Ezekiel smiled as he poured some sugar into his tea and mixed it together using his tea bag. Ezekiel then lifted the cup and drank all of it in one go. He placed the empty cup back down as he said, "I am not really a fan, but thanks for the tea." Ezekiel waited patiently to see if Melina would talk, but after almost 10 minutes he finally said, "I was hoping you would actually chat with me, but it looks like you won't." Ezekiel glanced at the photo album for a moment before he said, "I plan to get Natasha and Yelena out of the Red Room, along with all the other girls currently there. I will give them the chance to live a normal life, even though I know most of them won't choose it. As for you, I wanted to offer you a job teaching the girls." Melina's eyes widened the tiniest bit at the mention of Natasha and Yelena's name, but instantly went back to normal afterwards. Ezekiel waited patiently again, but after another 5 minutes Melina still hadn't talked. Ezekiel slowly stood up as he said, "Looks like you aren't interested and I have better things to do. If you change your mind though, just show up at the Red Room in a week." Ezekiel started to turn around and walk out of the room as he said, "Oh, and a word of advice. The Red Room is no longer working for the betterment of your country and its people. Why else do you think someone like Alexei is currently in prison?" It wasn't because he was criticizing the government, it was because he didn't like what Dreykov was doing. Ezekiel faded out of view, like a mirror shattering as he walked out of the room. He turned around and looked at Melina for another moment before he said, "Looks like the first recruit failed." Tao nodded her head as she said, "Possibly. Maybe your next one will go easier?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Doubtful. Without Melina, I think this one will be a failure also." Tao opened up a new portal and followed Ezekiel through it to their next destination. In the real world, Melina was quiet for a few minutes as she watched the spot where the man just was. She glanced at the photo album before she stood up and went to the freezer and pulled out a bottle of vodka. She opened the bottle and took a long drink from it as she walked to her computer. She needed to find out some information before she made her next move. VVVVV. Tao and Ezekiel were in the mirror dimension as they walked through one of the most secure prisons in Russia. They moved towards the security room of the prison. Ezekiel wanted to take over their systems before they met their target. Once they arrived at the security room, Tao and Ezekiel left the mirror dimension. Ezekiel walked towards the three men stationed at the monitors as he said, "Excuse me, but you gentlemen wouldn't happen to know the way to the bathroom. I think I got lost." The three men immediately turned towards Ezekiel, and right afterwards they relaxed into their chairs as their eyes glazed over. As Ezekiel inserted a USB into the computer system, Tao said, "That was new. Normally you do something with your hands and whisper something when you use that ability." Ezekiel typed on the computer as he said, "I've been practicing the ability using only the sound of my voice. For normal humans, it's more than enough to overpower them." Ezekiel removed the USB and turned back to look at Tao as he said, "I found the target and set the video footage to loop for the next few hours. Let's get out of here." Tao pulled Ezekiel back into the mirror dimension with her before they left to go find their newest recruit. They walked through the bare concrete corridors for about 10 minutes till they came to the cell they were looking for. They looked inside and a man was currently laid back on his bunk reading a book. After a few moments, Tao pulled the man into the mirror dimension with them. The man glanced over at Ezekiel, who was standing just in front of the open cell door as he said, "Alexei, can we have a few minutes of your time?" Alexei studied Ezekiel for a moment before he glanced behind him to look at Tao. He then looked back at his book as he said, "I am not giving out autographs today." Ezekiel smiled wide as he said, "It's a good thing we didn't come for an autograph. We just wanted to offer you a job." Alexei glanced up from his book before he said, "I don't need a job. Now leave me alone." "Really? I thought someone like the Red Guardian would jump at the chance to help people. But I guess you aren't really a hero, are you? Just a government experiment turned into a propaganda machine." As Alexei stood up, the book in his hands ripped right in half. He glowered at Ezekiel as he said, "You know nothing about me." Ezekiel raised his hands up in a pacifying manner as he said, "You're right. I don't know you personally. I have read some of your psych profiles, though. One thing all the reports say is that you have a hero complex. I personally don't find that a bad thing. I actually have that complex myself. It's part of the reason I came here." Alexei glanced at the book he ripped in half before he sat down and said, "What do you want?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "A job offer is mostly why I came. And to also offer you a chance to reconnect with your fake daughters, Natasha and Yelena." Alexei looked at Ezekiel instantly. He studied him for a few moments before he asked, "How do you plan to do that?" "I plan to rescue them from the Red Room, along with all the other girls currently there. I came here hoping you would like to help me, and afterwards, I will need help taking care of them and training them." Alexei's hands tightened a little, and his voice took on a dangerous edge as he said, "What are your plans for those girls?" Ezekiel waved off Alexei's words as he said, "I already told you I have a hero complex. I plan to rescue them from that place. I would just take them back to their families if I could, but you and I both know that isn't an option. The things those girls have been put through needs to be dealt with properly. I have a way to help speed up the process, but they will still need help." Ezekiel sighed, then said, "As for the training, I won't lie. I don't think most of them will be able to live a normal life anymore. Instead of training them to be heartless assassins, I was hoping to convert them into something better or different. Something they could make the choice to become themselves, instead of being forced into the role." Alexei watched Ezekiel for a while before he said, "If you try to attack the Red Room, those girls you're trying to save will fight you. You might just end up killing them, instead of saving them. You don't have to worry about any of that. I will take the red room and all the girls will be safe. Not a single one will be hurt when I do it." Ezekiel grinned as he said, "I am in no rush. How about I give you a few days to think about it? I will be back on Friday. That gives you 5 days to think it over." Alexei was forced out of the mirror dimension before he could speak, while Tao made a portal for Ezekiel and her to go to their next target.